There were things we did every single day in the 1960s, without thinking twice, that today would stop you in your tracks. Not because they were wrong, simply because life itself worked differently. Most people remember what they did back then, but not why it mattered or how it shaped the quiet rhythm of our days. Picture a crisp morning in a small town or suburb. The sun hasn't quite reached the rooftops, yet front doors are already opening. Radios hum softly through living rooms as families stir awake. The milkman's van clinks its bottles on the doorstep, and there's the smell of fresh bread from the corner shop drifting through the streets. Children tie their shoelaces, pets stretch, and somewhere a kettle begins to whistle. It's ordinary, and yet, in that ordinariness, life feels strangely full. There were habits so natural we never even noticed them. Notes left on the kitchen table reminding a sibling of chores, a small pocket of coins saved each week for sweets, or simply walking the few streets to school with neighbors waving from their gardens. At the time, these routines were invisible, just part of living. Here on Past Britannia, we don't just remember the past, we step back into it. If this already feels familiar, tap like and make sure you subscribe so these memories don't fade away. And the next habit was so normal, children never even asked permission. In the 1960s, Britain was a country caught between holding on to old ways and stepping into something new. Post-war routines still shaped daily life, from the way meals were served to the rhythm of the working week. Communities mattered more than convenience. People knew their neighbors, and streets weren't just paths to somewhere else. There were spaces where life quietly unfolded. Everyday life followed a familiar structure. Breakfast at the same time each morning, tea in the afternoon, Sunday lunch with family gathered around the table. Weeks had a predictable pattern. Market day, shopping trips, school runs, and local clubs or church meetings. Shops closed early, and the idea of 24-hour access to everything was unimaginable. Choices were fewer, but expectations were clear, and people moved through their days with a kind of steady certainty. Social trust was woven into these routines. Unspoken rules guided behavior. You didn't need a sign to tell you how to queue or when to be polite. Neighbors kept an eye on one another, quietly making sure children were safe, parcels were delivered, and no one went unnoticed. There was a comforting sense that someone always knew where you were, and responsibility was shared rather than enforced. Back then, life moved at a slower pace, but somehow it felt fuller. Time wasn't measured in notifications or alarms. It was measured in the rise and fall of daily routines, in the smell of toast in the morning, the sound of bicycles on the road, the rustle of paper bags in the market. There was space to breathe, to notice small details that today might go entirely unseen. And yet, amid this calm, one habit stood out, a practice involving children, freedom, and a level of trust that would feel almost unbelievable today. It was ordinary, accepted, and yet quietly remarkable, shaping an entire generation without anyone thinking twice. One of the most striking habits of 1960s Britain was the freedom children had to roam their streets, often without a single adult in sight. It wasn't recklessness, it was normal. Streets were social spaces, not just thoroughfares. You'd see children cycling from one end of the neighborhood to the other, kicking balls, racing friends, or simply wandering to the corner shop. Boundaries weren't dictated by rules written on a notice board. They were learned through experience. A scraped knee or a missed curfew taught lessons far more enduring than any lecture could. The details of these journeys remain vivid in memory. The satisfying click of a front door closing behind you, the rough feel of the pavement beneath your shoes, the way you could sense the passage of time without a clock. Knowing exactly when to be home wasn't imposed by a watch or a smartphone. It was ingrained, passed down from parent to child, reinforced by neighbors' quiet expectations. There were no constant check-ins, no calls to ensure safety. Responsibility was shared, trust was assumed, and mistakes were simply part of learning. Today, this level of independence feels almost unimaginable. Public spaces carried their own codes. In shops or public transport, people moved quietly and patiently. Standing in a queue wasn't just expected, it was understood. Conversations were gentle, tone measured, volume considered. These behaviors weren't policed, but they shaped the rhythm of daily life. Everyone knew the unwritten rules, and everyone followed them, not out of fear, but out of respect for a shared social understanding. Why did it work so seamlessly? Communities were smaller, more familiar. Faces were recognized, names remembered, and trust was built over time, layer by layer. People took care of one another naturally, and children absorbed these lessons without being told. It was a subtle, pervasive structure that gave order to ordinary days, yet left room for exploration and independence. And yet, as remarkable as these habits were outside, perhaps the most surprising and telling habit wasn't found on the streets at all. It happened inside the home, in the quiet routines of family life, shaping character in ways that would go unnoticed for decades. The ordinary rhythms of domestic life held secrets of a generation's values, lessons that modern Britain rarely encounters today. Inside the home, life in the 1960s followed its own quiet rhythm, one that rarely needed words. Household routines were remarkably consistent. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner occurred at familiar times. Beds were made, chores completed, and everyone knew their part without constant reminders. There were clear roles and clear expectations. Yet these weren't rigid impositions, they were absorbed naturally. Children learned not through instruction but by watching older siblings, parents, or neighbors. Observation was the guide, and repetition the teacher. Small details made these routines feel tangible and lived in. Notes might be left on the kitchen table, a reminder to tidy a room, feed the pets, or fetch an item from the shop. Chairs were placed carefully around the table at mealtimes, each family member's place familiar and fixed. There was a calm, unspoken understanding that when tasks needed doing, everyone simply did them. The quiet that filled these homes wasn't emptiness. It was a shared comprehension that each person knew their part. It was a subtle form of order, one that required no announcement, no rules posted on the wall, and yet it worked beautifully. These habits shaped patience and independence. Learning to manage oneself within a household taught responsibility without pressure. Mistakes happened, but they were part of growing up. Over time, though, these habits faded, not in a sudden moment of change, but quietly. As new technologies, regulations, and modern conveniences began to structure life differently, guidance replaced assumption, safety systems replaced instinct, and the shared understanding that had been so natural slowly disappeared. Back then, children and adults alike carried these small, self-directed responsibilities as a matter of course. Today, the emphasis is on supervision and direction, on explicit rules and measured outcomes. The world feels safer, of course, but it lacks the quiet independence that was once second nature. Nothing dramatic disappeared. No single habit was outlawed, no tradition erased. It simply stopped being normal. The routines, the unspoken rules, the small acts of trust, they drifted from daily life until they were remembered only in faint echoes. And when you realize why these habits vanished, it changes how you see the present, and perhaps even the way you look at your own childhood, or the childhoods of those around you. People often look back on the 1960s not because life was perfect, but because it felt profoundly human. Days weren't measured in schedules or screens, they were measured in people. Families, neighbors, and communities shaped the rhythm of life more than any rule or regulation ever could. There was a subtle richness in these routines, a sense that life was built around human connection rather than processes or systems. Part of the longing comes from what it felt like to belong. Children felt known, not just supervised. Neighbors noticed when someone was missing, or when a task went undone. Trust was assumed, not policed. Even the smallest gestures away from across the street, a note left on the kitchen table, a gentle reminder at the end of the day carried weight. Being part of this unspoken understanding gave a quiet confidence, a feeling of safety that was deeply personal. And yet, these were small things, almost invisible at the time, but they quietly shaped British life forever. Independence, responsibility, and respect were learned naturally, almost without thinking. They weren't taught in lessons or emphasized by authority. They were absorbed in the day-to-day, in the spaces between school, home, and community. Of course, progress brought clarity and safety. We live in a world with rules, guidance, and protections that were unimaginable back then, but along with that certainty came something subtle slipping away. The freedom to navigate the world by instinct, the chance to learn from small mistakes, the quiet sense of being trusted. And as we reflect on these changes, it invites a gentle question. So what did we gain, and what slipped through our fingers? What was lost in the process of becoming safer, more regulated, more predictable? It is a question that quietly lingers, just beyond the edges of memory, and it prepares us to look at today in a new light. Looking back, the contrast between then and now is striking. In the 1960s, life was shaped by trust, by a shared understanding that people would do what was expected without constant oversight. Streets, homes, and schools moved at a gentle, familiar rhythm, guided more by instinct than instruction. Today, there are more rules, more protection, and far less assumption. Every step is explained, every risk assessed, and care takes a different form, one of caution rather than quiet confidence. It isn't better or worse, just different. One era nurtured independence and responsibility through trust. The other nurtures safety and clarity through structure. Both have their merits, yet it's impossible not to feel a quiet nostalgia for the simple freedoms that quietly shaped a generation. Do you remember any of these habits? Take a moment to think back and share a memory that lingers. And if this brought back a sense of familiarity, send it to someone who lived through it, or perhaps someone who wishes they had. Thanks for stepping back in time with Past Britannia, where ordinary life is never forgotten. Even in the quietest routines, there is a story and a reminder of how much those everyday moments truly meant.